Uh, Thank you for taking me the floor, dear colleagues. Thank you for attention at the situation in Ukraine. I'm Lina Kushch from National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. I'm a first secretary of our largest journalist organization in Ukraine with 17,000 members. And I would like to thank you at first to New Europeans. They joined the International Journalism Festival in Perugia and calling for increased support of independent media and journalists in Ukraine. I thank to Dr. Wolfgang Reisman, coordinator of international project of Media Dialogue, who signed the declaration of support of Ukrainian journalists too. And I'd like to talk some about how journalists in Ukraine are working now and what problem we can see with during the war. I appreciate that you choose the topic about the future and reconstruction of Ukraine, but now we have a war, and as a journalist we are working covering the situation in different regions, including those of them where are combat zones. And Russia invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated once again the essential role of the independent journalism. Local journalists have never had experience in the war and gained it in a matter of days. There are problems with communication, electricity, transport, delivery of printed publication, and such other. But in time of war, we can see the big problem with keeping the journalist standards and with fact checkings that becomes a key factor on the work as a journalist. We can hear the question, is it possible to be objective during the war when you are a Ukrainian journalist? I'd like to say that we can be outside the process because we are inside, but we should be objective and we should keep the trust of our audience. Russia is using all the power of its propaganda to hide the truth. For example, one of well-known techniques is the creation of multi-version of events in order to preclude the establishment of facts and to question the conclusion of objective investigation. For example, it was in the case of Bucha, and you could see that Russia state information sources don't deserve any trust and are marketed in social networks. Ukraine provides foreign journalists with the opportunity to report, live, visit places near the front line and speak with local residents and experts. On the eve of the war, maybe after 2014, 2015, some events in Ukraine were often covered by foreign correspondents from Moscow. Often they viewed the military conflict in Ukraine as a civil war. Here is an example of news that, like the rebels and authorities in Kiev traded blame for an escalation in violence. Now, in the foreign press, we can see, and it's better to see, who is the aggressor and who is the victim. The first month of the war was covered in great detail. As you know, over 2,000 foreign journalists are working in Ukraine now. Now other events are beginning to come to the forefront, and warfare is getting used to. It's a dangerous trend, and we call to keep the attention to the situation. The next bad trend is that the news about Russian journalist Maria Ovsyannikova, who ran out with a poster on Russia's first channel. She will now work as a freelance journalist for the German newspaper Die Welt, covering events not only in Russia but also in Ukraine. We suppose that she could share any narratives of Russia propaganda, and it's not a good decision of German news, German media outlet, I think. We can hear many narratives of Russia propaganda in covering the situation, including foreign media. Pumping Ukraine with weapons will increase the escalation. Or people in Russia are not guilty. This is Putin's war. The people should be held accountable for Putin's crimes. Or sanction don't hit Putin, but ordinary Russians suffer, and many other Russian narratives we can meet in Western media, unfortunately, and in the social media as well. What will I advise to journalists coming to Ukraine to take in account? They must be remembered that Russia propaganda uses Western standards of journalism to its advantage. We have all seen the killing in Bucha, and more foreign journalists have been there and in a week than in Ukraine in recent years. Russia denies the killing and calls them staging. Is this a second opinion for an article? Of course not. It's very important to pay attention to the wording as well. For example, Novaya Gazeta Europe wrote about the new mayor of Mariupol. Such names legitimize the occupation regime because the old so-called mayor of Mariupol was elected in democratic election and retains his post. The city doesn't give up. The new mayor of Mariupol has been appointed by the Russian military. It's not the mayor. Journalists can become victims of manipulation, I think. Russia propaganda is aimed at them and their audience, that two sides are always in blame in a conflict. Russia is not profitable. Ukrainians or Americans are no better. The purpose of such manipulation is to reduce the pressure on Russia and allow it to move forward. It's so important for us that the situation in Ukraine will remain on the focus of international media. As to Ukrainian journalists, there are even more threats to journalists in the occupied territories. Some journalists were detained or are still detained by Russia troops. 20 journalists were killed covering the situation in combat zone. There was Ukrainian and foreign journalists, 20 journalists since 24 of February. Access to Ukrainian sources of information on the occupied territory is blocked, and journalists are being kidnapped or their relatives are kidnapped. And Reporters Without Borders, and by support of UNESCO and the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, prepared an Ukrainian language version of the safety guide for journalists. It's the famous safety guide in the world. After a half of hour, we started with the training for Ukrainian journalists, or safety training for Ukrainian journalists. I expect that this handbook offers practical advice to reporters, especially for local reporters who, as I thought, have no experience in covering, working in combat zones. As to the occupied regions or regions are on the controlled by Ukrainian government, the media can't resume work because they lack the traditional sources of income, like subscription, like advertising, and the war dealt a significant blow to Ukrainian regional publishers. Their audience on the internet is much smaller. Unlike these several conditions, we still we continue our work, and Ukrainian journalists continue to work and covering the events, especially for the audience in regions with combat zones, or in regions who adopted many IDPs and such other. I think it's important to unite our sources, to unite our efforts for the fight against destructive propaganda in Ukraine and in Russia, or in Europe as well, and to unite our efforts for save the independent journalism in Ukraine, and help to journalists to be independent and to continue their work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lina.